She arrived in Frostvale Ridge with snow in her hair, a cracked leather satchel, and a letter of employment signed by a man who hadn't even seen her face. What Sheriff Gavin Ashcroft got when that train door opened was not what he'd imagined. What Aliska Dvorak stepped into was not what she'd hoped. And what the town of Frostvale got, this stubborn, weathered, cold-bitten place that believed it already knew everything worth knowing, was something it hadn't asked for and couldn't yet understand. One woman, one impossible winter, and a silence between two broken people that would either destroy them both or become the most unexpected thing either of them had ever survived. If this story already has you, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let's see just how far this story travels. Now settle in, this one's going to take a while. The train was 40 minutes late, which gave Gavin Ashcroft exactly 40 minutes longer than he wanted to stand on that platform in the wind. He turned up his collar against the cold somewhere around the 20-minute mark and stopped pretending he wasn't freezing somewhere around 30. Now he just stood there, hands jammed into the pockets of his sheepskin coat, watching the gray horizon for a smoke trail that wasn't coming fast enough. The station master, old Pete Huxley, had stopped trying to make conversation after the third time Gavin gave him a one-word answer. Pete knew the sheriff well enough to read the silence. Gavin wasn't in the mood. Gavin was almost never in the mood these days, but today in particular, he had the look of a man who was rethinking something significant. The advertisement had been his deputy's idea. That was the truth of it, though Gavin had been the one to finally write it out and send it to the territorial paper. 3 weeks ago, sitting in his office with a cold stove and a pile of unread reports, he'd put ink to paper. Position available in Frostvale Ridge. Household management, cooking, general frontier upkeep. Applicants must be capable, self-sufficient, and unbothered by harsh winters. He hadn't mentioned the isolation. He hadn't mentioned that the last two women who'd answered similar advertisements had lasted a combined total of 11 weeks before boarding trains headed east without so much as a forwarding address. One response came back. Just one, in a careful, slightly formal hand that suggested English wasn't the writer's first language. Her name was Aliska Dvorak. She was 28 years old, originally from somewhere in Central Europe that Gavin couldn't place on a map, and she'd been working as a cook and housekeeper in a boarding house in a larger town 2 territories over. She could preserve food, manage a root cellar, repair fabric, tend animals, and keep accounts. She had references. She did not, notably, ask many questions about Frostvale itself, which Gavin had taken as either admirable practicality or concerning lack of judgment. He'd written back. She'd confirmed. And here he was, standing on a platform in the January wind, waiting for a woman he'd never met to step off a train into one of the most unforgiving corners of the American frontier. The smoke appeared on the horizon right around the time Gavin had lost feeling in his left ear. He straightened up, squared his shoulders, and tried to arrange his expression into something that didn't look like deep personal misgiving. The train groaned into the station with the usual theatrical excess. The screeching of brakes, the hiss of steam, the shudder of iron settling into stillness. A handful of passengers disembarked first. A traveling salesman Gavin recognized, 2 men he didn't. A woman with a child who was immediately met by someone Gavin assumed was her husband. He watched the door. He watched it for long enough that he started to wonder if somehow he'd misread the date, if she'd missed the connection, if the whole arrangement had fallen apart without his knowledge. Then she stepped down. He knew it was her because she was the last one off the train, and because she carried nothing except a single leather satchel that had seen better years. The stitching around the handle was coming loose, and the color had faded to a kind of uncertain brown that might once have been deep chestnut. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, solid in the way that suggested real physical work rather than idleness, with dark hair pinned back beneath a wool hat that had a small tear near the brim. Her coat was good quality once, probably, but it had been repaired at least twice that Gavin could see, and the hem was damp from snow she'd tracked through somewhere along the route. She stood on the platform and looked at Frostvale Ridge with the careful, measuring expression of someone taking an honest inventory. She didn't look frightened. That was the first thing Gavin noticed. He walked toward her. She spotted him before he reached her. His badge was visible, and he supposed he looked sufficiently like a man waiting for someone rather than waiting for a train. "Miss Dvorak," he said. "Yes." Her accent was there, distinct but not heavy, the kind that came from someone who'd worked hard at the language and mostly gotten there. She looked at him directly, which some people found unsettling when they weren't expecting it. Gavin found it neither unsettling nor particularly reassuring. It was just a look. "Sheriff Ashcroft?" "That's right." He nodded at her satchel. "That everything?" "Yes." He waited a half second to see if she'd offer anything more. An explanation, an apology for the lateness of the train, some social pleasantry to ease the introduction. She didn't. She just stood there in the wind with her worn-out bag and her direct eyes, waiting for him to do whatever came next. "All right," he said. "Wagons out front." The drive to his property took the better part of an hour on roads that had been bad before the last storm and were considerably worse after it. Gavin drove. Eliska sat beside him on the bench seat, her satchel wedged between her feet, watching the landscape with what appeared to be genuine attention. He'd half expected questions. About the town, about the job, about what exactly she'd gotten herself into. But she asked almost nothing during the first 20 minutes, and the silence stretched out long enough that Gavin stopped expecting to have to fill it. Eventually she asked, "How bad are the winters here?" "Bad," he said. She nodded, like that was the answer she'd been expecting. "The advertisement said harsh," she said. "Harsh is a polite word for it." Another silence. The horse picked its way through a drift that had blown across the road sometime in the last 12 hours, and Gavin had to work the reins a little to keep them on track. "The last person," Eliska said. "How long did she stay?" Gavin glanced at her sideways. 6 weeks. "And the one before?" He paused. 5. Eliska didn't respond to that immediately. She looked out at the white landscape, at the dark lines of the pine trees against the gray sky, at the way the wind was picking up snow from the fields and throwing it in long, trailing sheets across the road. Her expression was unreadable, but not distressed. "I'm not leaving after 5 weeks," she said finally. It wasn't a vow or a declaration. It was said the same way someone might note that they preferred coffee to tea. A plain statement of fact. Gavin didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. His property came into view around a bend in the road. A cabin that was solidly built, but showed the evidence of 2 years of a man living alone and not particularly caring about the details. The front steps needed attention. The firewood pile was down to a concerning level for this point in January. One of the shutters on the east-facing window had come loose from its upper hinge and was hanging at an angle that would not survive the next serious wind. He watched Eliska take it all in as he pulled the wagon up. She was quiet for a moment. "The shutter will need to come down before tonight," she said. "If the wind picks up again, it'll take the whole frame with it." Gavin looked at the shutter. He'd been meaning to deal with it for 2 weeks. "Yeah," he said. "I'll need to see the stove before I can tell you about the food situation." "Kitchen's through the main room." She picked up her satchel and climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, which he hadn't offered and she apparently hadn't expected. He watched her walk toward the front steps, paused to test the second one with her weight. It creaked badly but held, and pushed the door open. He stayed with the horse for a moment, unhitching and leading the animal around back to the small stable, taking longer than necessary. There was something disorienting about arriving home and having someone already inside it, moving through the rooms. He'd lived alone for 2 years. He was used to the specific quiet of a house that contained only one person. When he came inside, Eliska was standing at the kitchen stove with the door open, looking at the interior with the focused expression of a doctor examining a patient. "When did you last clean this properly?" she asked, without turning around. "October, maybe." She made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a grunt. "I'll need to do it tonight. The draft is wrong. It's pulling backward when it should be pushing up. It's a wonder you haven't been half suffocating in here." Gavin stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and thought about the persistent headaches he'd had in November, which he'd attributed to stress. "There's a problem with the pipe," he said. "There are several problems," Eliska said, still examining the stove. "I'll start with the most dangerous ones." She worked until past 10 that night. Gavin had expected, he wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected, some settling in maybe, an assessment, a period of adjustment before the actual work began. What he did not expect was for her to ask him, within the first hour, where he kept his tools, and to spend the remaining daylight hours dealing with the shutter, the stovepipe, a gap in the weather stripping around the back door that was letting in a finger width of outside air, and the firewood situation, which she addressed by putting on her coat and splitting wood herself while Gavin stacked it, because she'd simply handed him the other end of the job without asking whether he intended to help. By the time she finally sat down, the cabin was warmer than it had been since probably September. She made a simple supper from what she found in his larder. Not remarkable food, but hot and sufficient. And they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. He noticed she ate like someone who didn't always know when the next meal was coming. Not desperately, but with the kind of focused attention to the food that came from having gone without at some point. "The root cellar," she said. "You have one?" "Out back, past the stable. I'll need to assess it tomorrow. Whatever's in there, we need to know if it will last until March." "It's not going to be pretty," he said. "It rarely is." She looked at him across the table. "You should know I'm not going to cook well with nothing. I need a proper inventory of what you have, and I need to know how often you're able to get to town." "Depends on the weather. Good weeks, twice. Bad weeks." He shrugged. "Sometimes not at all." She nodded. She didn't seem alarmed by this. "Then we plan for the worst weeks." Gavin looked at this woman sitting at his table, who had arrived 6 hours ago with a single bag and had since repaired a shutter, fixed his stove draft, sealed his back door, split firewood, made supper, and was now calmly discussing emergency food planning like it was the most natural conversation in the world, and he found he didn't quite know what category to put her in. "You should get some sleep," he said. "Your room's at the end of the hall. There's extra blankets in the chest." "I'll need the lamp for another hour. It's yours." He pushed back from the table. "Don't stay up so late, you're useless tomorrow." She looked at him, and for just a moment something crossed her face that might have been amusement and might have been something sharper. "I'm never useless," she said. He said nothing. He went to bed. He lay awake for a while, listening to the faint sounds of her moving through the kitchen, the occasional scrape of something being shifted, the creak of the floorboard near the door to the root cellar access, the sounds of another person in the house. He'd forgotten what that felt like, and he was surprised to find it didn't bother him as much as he'd expected. The town found out about her by noon the following day. This was the nature of Frostvale Ridge. It wasn't a large place, perhaps 230 residents, depending on how you counted the outlying homesteads, and news moved through it the way cold moved through a poorly sealed cabin, pervasive, finding every gap, impossible to stop once it started. Gavin had known there would be talk. He'd prepared himself for it in a general way. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the specific texture of the talk, which he got his first sample of when he stopped at the general store mid-morning to pick up a few supplies he'd forgotten to get before meeting the train. Ida Calloway ran the store with her husband Dale, and she had opinions about most things in Frostvale and was not shy about sharing them. She waited approximately until the door had closed behind Gavin before she said, "So I hear you brought someone in on the afternoon train yesterday." "That's right." "A woman." "That's right." Ida set down the jar she'd been pricing. "They say she's foreign." "She's from Central Europe," Gavin said. "You want to tell me the price on that lamp oil, or are we just going to stand here?" "And they say she's—" Ida seemed to be choosing her word. "Heavy set." Gavin looked at her steadily. "She's a competent housekeeper who arrived with a full set of references and had the stove working properly before I went to bed last night, which is more than I've managed in 2 years. The lamp oil, Ida." Ida told him the price. He paid it. But as he left, he caught the end of whatever she said to Dale in a lowered voice, and the word shame was in it somewhere, and it turned his stomach in a way he recognized as anger and chose not to act on. Not yet. By the end of the week, he'd had 4 separate conversations with people who wanted to express some version of the same concern. Eliska was not suited to frontier life. Eliska would leave before spring. A woman of her size wouldn't be able to manage the physical demands of the work. A woman with her background wouldn't understand the way things were done in Frostvale. Ed Marsh, who ran the livery, went so far as to say, with what he seemed to consider genuine helpfulness, that Gavin might have done better to be more specific in the advertisement about what he was looking for. "I was specific," Gavin said. "I got exactly what I asked for." Ed Marsh shook his head in the manner of a man who knew better and was exercising great patience in not saying so. Gavin did not tell any of this to Eliska. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Partly because it wasn't information she needed to function, and partly because he had the sense that telling her would be somewhat like informing the stove that it was cold outside, She was already aware of the climate and had adjusted her approach accordingly. He saw the evidence of this the first time she came to town with him. It was a supply run, nothing more. She had a list she'd spent 2 days compiling from her inventory of the larder and root cellar, organized by priority and store, which Gavin found both useful and slightly unnerving in its thoroughness. They went on a Thursday, the weather being clear enough to make good time on the roads. He watched her move through the town and saw what happened. The looks, the whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. A cluster of women outside the millinery who stopped talking when Aliska walked past and then started again immediately after. 2 men at the post office who didn't bother to lower their voices at all and said something that Gavin didn't catch, but that he could read the shape of in their expressions. Aliska walked through all of it like she was walking through weather. Head up, list in hand, stopping at each store with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything. She was not performing obliviousness. She heard it. He could tell she heard it. But she did not flinch, and she did not slow down, and she did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing it land. At the dry goods store, a woman named Vera Colt, whose opinion of herself was considerably higher than Gavin's opinion of her, looked Aliska up and down with the particular brand of cruelty that hides itself inside politeness, and said, "My, you've taken on quite a project, haven't you, Sheriff? She looks like she might eat you out of house and home." The store went quiet. Several people were pretending to examine shelving. Aliska looked at Vera Colt with an expression of complete neutrality. "I eat what I earn," she said. "I've been earning since I was 12. How about yourself?" Vera Colt's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The expression that crossed her face was the particular combination of offense and uncertainty that comes from being hit by something unexpected. Gavin paid for the dry goods. On the way home, he said nothing for a while. Then, "You didn't have to answer her." "No," Aliska agreed, "but I chose to. It's going to make people like her angrier." "I know." She was looking at the road ahead. "People like her were already angry. The question was whether I was going to pretend not to notice. I've tried pretending. It doesn't make them stop." Gavin thought about that. He thought about it for the better part of the drive home. "It might make it harder for you here," he said finally. Aliska turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that was neither warm nor cold, but simply honest. The way the landscape around them was honest, without pretense, exactly what it appeared to be. "Sheriff," she said, "every place has been hard for me. Crossvale isn't different in that respect. What's different is that here I have a job I'm good at, a roof that doesn't leak, and a stove that now works properly. I'm not going to throw that away because Vera Colt has an ugly mouth and too much free time." Gavin said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road. But something in him, some tight-held thing, shifted fractionally in a direction he didn't have a name for yet. February came in like a fist. The temperature dropped to levels that made the January cold seem like an act of kindness by comparison. 2 days into the month, a storm came down from the northwest that kept them inside for 3 straight days, and Gavin, who was accustomed to bad weather and the cabin fever that came with being trapped by it, found himself experiencing a siege of the kind he hadn't expected. Not from the storm, from proximity. He was not a man who talked easily or often. His deputy, Tom Reeves, had once observed, not unkindly, that trying to have a conversation with Gavin was like trying to hold water in your hands. You could get it for a moment, but eventually it ran out and you were left with damp palms. Gavin knew this about himself and had mostly made his peace with it. After his wife Clara had died, 4 years ago now, a fever that came on fast and did its worst in a week, he'd retreated further into himself than he'd been before, and whatever social ease he'd once possessed had rusted somewhere along the way. The 3 days of the storm, he discovered, were not going to be silent. Not because Aliska was a talker. She wasn't, particularly, but she had a way of asking practical questions that somehow became other things. On the first day, she asked about the property lines, because she'd noticed some fence markers that didn't match the deed copy she'd found in the cabinet where he kept household papers. And the conversation went sideways into the dispute with the neighboring property, the Hallett Ranch specifically, and the ongoing question of the eastern pasture that Gavin had been too tired to pursue through proper channels. And he found himself describing a situation he hadn't talked about with anyone in 6 months. On the second day, she asked about Clara. Not directly. She asked about the photograph on the mantelpiece, which she'd been careful not to disturb, but which she'd obviously noticed. He answered shortly that it was his late wife. Eliska said she was sorry. Then a silence that lasted long enough that Gavin thought they were done with it. Then she said quietly, "How long ago?" 4 years, he said. She nodded and went back to the mending she was doing, and that was the end of it. But something about the fact that she didn't push further, didn't offer condolences that turned into questions, didn't fill the space with sympathetic noise, something about that opened something in him rather than closing it, which was the opposite of what usually happened when people brought up Clara. He found himself talking about her. Not much, not the big things. Small ones. The fact that she'd hated the cold with a passion that seemed excessive even for people who lived somewhere reasonable, and here she'd chosen to follow him to Frostvale. The fact that she'd had a laugh that was too loud for polite company. The fact that 4 years was long enough that he sometimes couldn't remember exactly what she'd sounded like, and that bothered him more than he could explain. Eliska listened. She didn't say much. She said enough. By the third day of the storm, Gavin had the strange and slightly alarming sensation that he was having more real conversations with this woman he'd known for 5 weeks than he'd had with anyone in the 2 years prior. He didn't know what to do with that. He put it somewhere in the back of his mind and did his best to ignore it. On the fourth day, the storm broke and they dug themselves out. The work of digging out took most of the morning. The snow had drifted against the north side of the cabin to a depth that blocked the door and reached the lower windowsills. Gavin did the heavy work of the main path. Eliska, without being asked, dealt with the stable access and the root cellar entry, and when Gavin came around the building, he found her shoulder-deep in a drift, working with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. "You've seen worse winters than this," he said. It wasn't a question. "My home country," she said, not pausing in her work. "Where I grew up, the winters were—" She paused, finding the English. "Merciless. This is harsh. Where I came from was something else." "Then why'd you leave?" She straightened up and looked at him, snow on her shoulders, her breath a cloud in the cold air. Something crossed her face, a complexity that was there and then wasn't, replaced by the practical expression he was starting to know as her default setting. "The same reason most people leave anywhere," she said, "because staying was no longer possible." She went back to digging. Gavin stood for a moment in the snow, thinking about that, and about all the different weights that sentence could carry. Then he picked up his shovel and went back to his side of the work. The incident with Hector Birch happened in the third week of February. Hector Birch ran the sawmill at the edge of town and was the kind of man who mistook volume for authority. He was not a bad man in any way that would have gotten him in serious trouble, but he was the sort who said things that other people thought but knew better than to voice, and he'd appointed himself the spokesperson for a general sentiment in Frostvale that Gavin was making a mistake. He showed up at the cabin on a Tuesday morning. Gavin was in town. Eliska was not. By the time Gavin got back, the exchange was over, but he could reconstruct most of it from what Eliska told him flatly while continuing to stir a pot she was working on, like the story she was telling had happened to someone else entirely. Hector had knocked. She'd answered. Hector had asked if the sheriff was home. She'd said no. Hector had then said, with what Eliska described as a kind of false cheerfulness, that he wanted to talk to Gavin about this situation, by which he meant her, and that he hoped Gavin was going to do the right thing before the spring, and that it wasn't right for a man in Gavin's position to have a woman like her in his home. "A woman like me," Eliska repeated, still stirring. He said it twice. Gavin felt the particular kind of cold anger that sat in the chest and didn't need to shout. "What did you say?" "I said, I believe the sheriff is satisfied with the arrangement, but I'll let him know you called." Then I closed the door. Gavin looked at the back of her head, at the set of her shoulders, and tried to determine whether she was more bothered by this than she was letting on. He couldn't tell. She had a way of carrying things that made it difficult to assess the actual weight. "I'm going to talk to Hector," he said. "You don't need to," she said. I know I don't need to." She turned then and looked at him, and there was something in her face that was harder to read than her usual expression. Not quite emotion, but the outline of it. "I've had people like Hector Birch in every place I've lived," she said. "There's one in every town. They never stop because someone argues with them. They stop because they eventually find something else to worry about. If you go confront him, you make me a bigger problem for yourself and a bigger target for him." "He came to my house," Gavin said. "Yes, and he'll feel very important about having done it. The best thing you can do is make him feel unimportant. She turned back to the stove. Trust me. Gavin stood in the doorway for a long moment. He was not a man who was accustomed to being told to stand down, and he had the distinct impulse to go into town and find Hector Birch and say something that would make his position very clear. But he also recognized, somewhere under the anger, that Aliska was probably right, that she understood this particular kind of battle better than he did, that she'd been fighting it a lot longer. He hung up his coat. He sat down at the kitchen table. He did not go to find Hector Birch. "You're going to have to teach me that," he said. "How you do that?" "Do what?" "Not react." She looked at him over her shoulder, and this time the thing that crossed her face was unmistakably something warmer than her usual expression, though she turned back to the stove before he could examine it properly. "You're reacting right now," she said. "I'm talking. That's a kind of not reacting for you." A pause. "I've noticed." Gavin looked at the table. He didn't say anything, but something about the idea that she'd been paying enough attention to notice things about him settled somewhere in his chest with a weight that was not entirely uncomfortable. March was supposed to be better. It wasn't, especially. The cold held with the stubborn malice of something with a personal grudge. But there was a quality shift in the light that happened in the first week of the month. Still freezing, still brutal, but the sun was in a slightly different position in the sky, and it hit the snow differently, and something in the air suggested, distantly, that the worst was theoretically survivable. Aliska had, by this point, imposed an order on the cabin that Gavin had not known it was possible for it to have. The larder was organized and inventoried. The root cellar had been assessed, reorganized, and supplemented with what they'd been able to preserve and trade for over the preceding weeks. The firewood was maintained at a level that no longer gave Gavin the quiet anxiety of watching a pile diminish. The stove worked, the floors were clean, the broken things were fixed. But more than the physical changes, she'd done something to the atmosphere of the place that he couldn't fully explain. The house had had a specific quality before she arrived. Not unpleasant exactly, but hollow, like a room where the furniture had been removed and the echo hadn't settled. That quality was gone. He noticed it when he came in from long days in town and found the lamp lit, or found supper on the stove, or heard the sound of her moving through the kitchen. And what he noticed was that the hollow echo had been replaced by something he didn't have a word for and was careful not to examine too closely. Tom Reeves, his deputy, examined it for him in the unrequested and cheerful way that Tom had about most subjects. "You seem different," Tom said one afternoon in the office, with the particular air of someone who'd been waiting to say something for a while. "I'm not," Gavin said. "You're less—" Tom searched for the word. "Crusty." "I've always been exactly this crust." "You smiled yesterday when Mrs. Fenwick brought those rolls by." "I smile." "You really don't, Gavin. Not that I've seen in about 2 years." Tom leaned back in his chair with the comfortable confidence of someone who knew he was right and was secure enough to enjoy it. "She's good for you." Gavin said nothing. "I'm just making an observation," Tom said, "as your deputy." "Observations about my domestic situation are not within your official duties." "Good thing I'm doing it as your friend, then." Gavin picked up the report he'd been ignoring and started reading it. Tom, satisfied with the outcome, went back to his own work. The thing that happened with the Pendleton boy was different from everything else. Sam Pendleton was 9 years old, and he lived with his mother Margaret on the western edge of town after his father had died the previous spring. Margaret Pendleton worked hard and kept her son fed and clothed, but she was stretched thin in the way that single mothers on the frontier invariably were, and Sam spent a fair amount of time wandering in ways that were more or less managed, but not exactly supervised. He showed up at the cabin on a cold Thursday afternoon while Gavin was in town. He'd apparently followed the road out with no particular destination in mind and found himself at the gate, and Aliska had seen him from the kitchen window and come out. When Gavin got back, Sam was sitting at the kitchen table eating bread with preserves, and Aliska was across from him, listening to him talk with the focused attention she gave to everything she considered worth paying attention to. Sam scrambled up immediately when Gavin walked in, clearly unsure whether he was in trouble. Gavin looked at the boy, then at Aliska. "Sam Pendleton," Aliska said simply. "His mother knows where he is. I walked him up to the Hanley place, and Mrs. Hanley rode over to pass the word." Gavin looked at Sam. "You all right?" Sam nodded vigorously. He tells me he's been having trouble with the older boys at the schoolhouse, Aliska said, in a tone that was matter-of-fact but carried something underneath it, something that Gavin recognized, with a slight shift in his chest, as personal. Billy Marsh and those two from the Galt Ranch, Sam muttered, looking at the table. They say things. What kind of things? Gavin asked. Sam glanced at Aliska, then back at the table. About, he struggled, about how someone looks, how they talk, if they're different. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. They've been saying those things to you too? Gavin asked Aliska directly, because it seemed the room was going in that direction regardless. Aliska looked at Sam, not at Gavin. What I told Sam, she said, is that people who say those things are almost always afraid of something they don't understand. And the thing they don't understand is usually themselves. That doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes it mean less. Sam was looking at her with the expression of someone hearing something they'd needed to hear for a while. Also, Aliska said, I told him that bread with preserves helps more than people give it credit for. Sam, in spite of himself, almost smiled. Gavin stood in his kitchen and looked at this woman who had arrived 6 weeks ago with a cracked satchel and said she wasn't leaving, and felt something shift in his chest that was no longer fractional and no longer easy to put somewhere and ignore. He didn't say anything about it. He just asked Sam if he wanted more bread. Sam did. By the end of March, something had happened in Frostvale that nobody had planned and few people would have predicted. Aliska had become necessary, not to everyone. There were still people like Vera Colt and Hector Birch and the cluster of women outside the millenary who held to their original assessments and gave no sign of changing them. But there were others, enough of them, and significant enough ones, who had begun to revise their positions in the quiet, incremental way that people revise positions when reality contradicts their expectations. Margaret Pendleton had come to the cabin to thank Aliska for looking after Sam, and had stayed for 2 hours, and had left with a copy of a recipe for a soup that stretched 3 days of meals out of one chicken carcass. Old Doc Weaver had mentioned to Gavin that his housekeeper had gotten useful advice about food preservation from that Dvorak woman, and that the advice had been sound. Even Pete Huxley at the train station, who was essentially the town's living newspaper, had said to Gavin with a kind of surprised approval that he'd heard she was harder to rattle than she looks. She doesn't look like she's easy to rattle, Gavin had said. Well, Pete said, you know what I mean. Gavin did know. What Pete meant, translated from polite frontier understatement, was that he'd expected her to be rattled by now, and she wasn't, and that this had changed his assessment of her. Which was, in its way, progress. Aliska herself showed no awareness that her status in Frostvale was shifting, or she showed no outward awareness. With her, it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference between genuinely not knowing and simply not caring to respond. She went on doing what she did, working, managing, fixing, cooking, occasionally saying something precise and accurate in a way that stopped people mid-thought. She went on being exactly herself in a place that had decided before it met her that someone like her couldn't last. The snow started to thin in the last week of March. Not enough to trust, not enough to call spring, but enough to let through a quality of light that had been absent since November. Gavin was standing on the front porch of the cabin one afternoon, watching the change in the light on the hills, when Aliska came out and stood beside him. They stood in silence for a while. The cold was still there, but had lost some of its edge, and the sky was a clearer blue than it had been in months. How long does spring take to actually get here? Aliska asked. Here? Could be April, could be May, could snow again in April. Of course it could, she said, without any particular surprise. Another silence. You asked me when we were digging out last month, Aliska said, why I left. Gavin looked at her. He'd forgotten that conversation, or rather had assumed she'd decided not to continue it. I remember, he said. The real answer is that I had a sister in a bad situation, and I needed to be somewhere with regular wages to send money home. She said it plainly, not looking at him, watching the hills. That's why I answered the advertisement. I needed work that was reliable in a place where the cost of living was low enough that I could put something aside. Gavin was quiet for a moment. You've been sending money back. Every month. He thought about the care she took with the household accounts, the way she cataloged every expenditure. The fact that she'd never once asked for an advance on her wages. "How is she?" he asked. "Better?" Eliska said. "Getting better?" A pause. "That's enough for now." The light was going gold on the hills, the particular late afternoon gold of early spring that was different from any other light of the year. Gavin watched it for a moment and thought about the fact that this woman had come to the most isolated posting she could find in the middle of winter, alone, with a cracked bag and no backup plan, because someone she loved needed her to. "Eliska," he said. She looked at him. He didn't know entirely what he'd intended to say. What came out was, "You did good work this winter." It wasn't what he'd meant, or not all of what he'd meant, but it was what he could say, and he meant it completely. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Then she turned back to the hills. "So did you," she said. The light held for a few more minutes, gold deepening toward amber, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence between them was the kind that didn't need to be filled. April in Frostvale Ridge was not spring. It looked like spring in the way a forgery looks like the real thing, convincing at a distance, wrong up close. The snow thinned but didn't leave. The mud came up through it in dark patches that sucked at boot heels and swallowed wagon wheels to the axle if you weren't paying attention. The wind changed direction but not temperature, coming now from the west instead of the north, which meant it hit the left side of your face instead of the right, and felt, somehow, more personal. Eliska had been in Frostvale for 3 months. She knew this because she'd been keeping track in the small notebook she used for household accounts. Not marking the days dramatically, not counting down to anything, just noting the date at the top of each page the way she'd done since she was old enough to keep records. 3 months. 12 weeks. 84 days, give or take, of waking up in a room at the end of a hall in a cabin that belonged to a man who said very little and meant most of it. The previous 2 women had lasted 5 weeks and 6 weeks respectively. She didn't think about this with any particular pride. She thought about it the way she thought about most things, practically noting it as a data point that confirmed what she'd already believed about herself, that she was harder to dislodge than people expected. What she hadn't expected was how much the dislodging would still be attempted. The gossip hadn't stopped. She'd understood early on that it wouldn't, that in a town of 200 people with a hard winter and limited entertainment, a large foreign woman living in the sheriff's house was too useful a subject to abandon. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the creativity of it. By April, the stories being told about her in Frostvale had evolved from simple mockery of her appearance and accent into something more elaborate, that she was after Gavin's property, that she'd deceived him about her references, that she was running from something back east, and had used the advertisement as an escape route. Vera Colt, apparently, had a theory involving a criminal past that she was sharing freely with anyone who'd stand still long enough. Eliska heard about these theories the same way she heard about most things in Frostvale, through Margaret Pendleton, who had become, without either of them particularly planning it, something close to a friend. Margaret was direct in the way that women who'd survived genuine hardship tended to be. She didn't soften things unnecessarily, but she wasn't cruel about the truth either. "Vera's been talking," Margaret said one afternoon, sitting at Eliska's kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Sam having been deposited at the schoolhouse an hour earlier. "You should know what she's saying." "I probably already know the shape of it," Eliska said. "She's saying you forged the references." Eliska set down the pot she was holding. "Did she? And that you've got a husband somewhere back east who you ran out on." "I've never been married." "I know that," Margaret said. "I'm telling you what she's saying, not what's true." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "The thing is, some people are starting to listen, not the ones who know better, but there are enough who want a reason." Eliska picked the pot back up and moved it to the back of the stove. She was quiet for a moment, working through what this meant in practical terms. In her experience, rumors like this had a life cycle. They grew until they hit something solid enough to stop them, or until they collapsed under their own weight. The question was always which would happen first. "Does Gavin know?" she asked. "I imagine he hears things. He hasn't said anything to me." Margaret looked at her with the kind of knowing expression that Eliska had come to recognize as the particular insight of women who observed men carefully without fuss. "He wouldn't," Margaret said. "Not unless he thought you needed to act on it. He's not a man who talks about things unless they require talking about." Eliska sat down across from her. "No," she agreed. He's not. Margaret looked at her a beat longer than necessary. Eliska met her eyes and waited. You could defend yourself, Margaret said. Show the references. Let people see them. My references are my history, Eliska said. I've spent my whole life proving myself to people who decided before they met me that I wasn't worth the trouble. I'm not doing it again. Not here. Margaret was quiet. Then, carefully, that's a hard position to hold. Yes, Eliska said, but it's mine. They drank their coffee. Outside, the April mud was doing its worst to the road, and the wind was coming from the west in that personal, deliberate way it had developed. And somewhere in town, a woman with too much time was constructing stories. None of this was new. None of this was worse than what Eliska had survived before. But she sat at that table and felt the weight of it all the same, because feeling the weight was honest, and she'd always been better at honesty than at pretending it was lighter than it was. The difference, she thought, was that here she had a table to sit at, a stove that worked, a notebook with 3 months of dates in it. Those things were worth defending, even if defending them meant standing still in the face of something unpleasant. She was good at standing still. The work, at least, never stopped being satisfying. There was something about the specific challenges of managing a frontier household in difficult conditions that suited the part of Eliska's brain that needed problems to solve. When Gavin's horse threw a shoe in the second week of April and the nearest farrier was unavailable, she spent 2 hours researching in a veterinary manual she found in the back of the cabin's small bookshelf and talked Gavin through a temporary solution that would hold until the farrier made his rounds. When the cellar showed signs of dampness from the spring thaw, she remortared the problematic section herself over the course of a Saturday. When the chimney on the west side started smoking badly after a warm spell softened the creosote buildup, she climbed onto the roof and addressed it from above, while Gavin stood at the base of the ladder with an expression that suggested he had significant reservations about this approach. You don't need to be up there, he called. Somebody does, she called back. I could. You have a bad left knee. I've seen the way you favor it on the stairs. A pause while she worked. Come down when you're up here and your knee goes out. It'll be worse than the chimney. Silence from below. Then, I don't favor it. You do. Every morning for the first 20 minutes, you think I don't notice. A longer silence. Come down carefully. She came down carefully. The chimney, when tested, drew properly. Gavin looked at it and then at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his version of impressed, which was nearly identical to his version of neutral, but with a slightly different quality around the eyes. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said, and went inside to wash her hands. These small exchanges had become the texture of their daily life together. Not warm, exactly, but no longer cold. Something in between that she didn't have a word for in English and wasn't sure she had one for in her first language either. She'd lived in enough households to know that the relationship between an employer and a domestic worker was a specific kind of thing, defined by function, bounded by role, shaped by the power differential that was always present even when both people were decent enough not to wield it. This was something else. She wasn't sure what. She was careful not to examine it too directly, the same way she was careful around the fresh mortared section of the cellar. It needed time to set before you put weight on it. Gavin was careful in the same way, she thought. She could tell by the way he sometimes started to say something and then didn't, by the way he'd taken to making 2 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1, leaving hers on the counter without comment, by the way he'd stopped being startled when he came in and found her somewhere unexpected in the house, had stopped doing the small involuntary adjustment that people do when they're reminded of a presence they haven't fully accepted yet. He'd accepted it. He'd stopped being surprised by her. She found this unreasonably significant and was careful not to think about why. The incident that changed things in town happened on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of April, and it started, as many significant things in small towns do, with a problem nobody else could solve. The Kerrigan family, mother, father, and 4 children under 10, had come down with something that swept through their household in the space of 48 hours and left all of them too weak to manage the simplest tasks. Doc Weaver was down in the lower valley dealing with a difficult birth and wouldn't be back until the following day. Word got to Eliska through Sam Pendleton, who'd heard it from a schoolmate who was the Kerrigans' nearest neighbor's child. She went. She didn't tell Gavin first, which she knew might be a problem, but there wasn't time for a discussion about it. She packed what she could from the cabin's medical supplies and her own limited pharmaceutical knowledge, and walked the half-mile to the Kerrigan place in the April mud. What she found was a household in the particular kind of chaos that illness creates in a family with young children. The parents barely functional, the children frightened and hungry, the fire nearly out, the water situation dangerous. She spent 6 hours there. She got the fire going, boiled water, made broth from what she found in their larder, managed the children's temperatures with cool cloths, and kept fluids in them. And by the time she left at dusk, things were stable enough that she felt comfortable going. She was halfway home when Gavin's wagon came down the road toward her, moving with the purposeful speed of someone who'd been looking. He pulled up. He looked at her, muddy, tired, carrying an empty bag, with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "Margaret sent word," he said. "I was going to leave a note, but there wasn't time." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Get in," and moved over to make room. She climbed up. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than usual. Not the comfortable absence of need to speak, but something slightly charged, like the air before a storm. Aliska was tired enough that she didn't try to analyze it. She just sat and watched the road and let the silence be what it was. When they got back and she'd washed up and they were sitting at the kitchen table, Gavin said, "You should have left word before you went." "I know," she said. "I misjudged how long I'd be." "It's not about how long, it's about—" He stopped. He turned his coffee cup on the table, a small restless motion she'd noticed he did when he was working through something. If something had happened. Nothing happened. This time, she looked at him. He was looking at the table. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was trying to keep something contained, and she understood, with a kind of careful, measured clarity, that what she was looking at was not anger, or not only anger. "Gavin," she said. He looked up. "I've been taking care of people in difficult situations since I was old enough to carry a water bucket," she said. "I knew what I was walking into and I knew what I was doing. You don't have to worry about me the way you'd worry about someone who doesn't know their own capacity." He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression that was too quick to name. "It's not about capacity," he said. "Then what is it about?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I came home and you weren't here. There wasn't a note. I didn't know where you were." She held that for a moment. "And?" His jaw tightened slightly. "And I didn't like it," he said. "That's all." It wasn't all. They both knew it wasn't all. But she let it rest there because some things needed to be allowed to remain incomplete a little longer. And because she was tired, and because the way he'd said "I didn't like it," with that specific, almost reluctant honesty, like a man confessing something he'd rather not, had done something to the inside of her chest that she wasn't prepared to examine in front of him. "I'll leave a note next time," she said. "Thank you," he said. They drank their coffee. The Kerrigans recovered. This turned out to matter more than Aliska had anticipated. Grace Kerrigan was a woman of considerable social standing in Frostvale. Her husband Owen ran the town's small bank, and she was on the committee for every public event of significance, and her opinions carried the particular weight that comes from a combination of social position and a genuinely sharp mind. When she was back on her feet, she came to the cabin to thank Aliska in person, with all 4 children in tow, and the youngest, a girl of about 3 who appeared to have no social inhibitions whatsoever, immediately attached herself to Aliska's skirt and refused to let go for the duration of the visit. Grace Kerrigan watched this with an expression that was warm and assessing in equal measure. "You're nothing like what I expected," Grace said, "based on what people have been saying." "I rarely am," Aliska said. Grace smiled. A sharp, genuine smile that suggested she found this answer satisfying. "I want you to know that I'm aware of what Vera Colt has been spreading around, and I want you to know that I've said, directly to Vera's face, that she should occupy herself with things she actually knows something about, which leaves her very few options." Aliska looked at her. "You didn't need to do that." "I know," Grace said. "I wanted to. There's a difference." She disentangled the small child from Aliska's skirt and picked her up. "I hope you'll come to the community supper next month. I'd like people to know you in a context where you're not just a subject of speculation." Aliska thought about community suppers, about the specific quality of being watched and assessed while trying to eat, about the conversations that would start and stop when she approached, about Vera Colt's expression across a dining table. She thought about standing still in the face of something unpleasant. "I'll be there," she said. Grace nodded with the air of someone filing something useful away. "Good." She adjusted the child on her hip. "One more thing. The rumors about your references. Would you be willing to show them to me? Not for the town, just for my own knowledge." Aliska looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I'll have them ready before you go." She showed them. 3 letters from previous employers, all legitimate, all detailed enough to be clearly not fabricated. Grace read each one carefully and handed them back without ceremony. "Thank you," Grace said. "You're the first person who's actually asked," Aliska said. Grace looked at her with that sharp, warm expression again. "I know," she said. "That's a problem with this town. We make up our minds first and ask questions when it's convenient. You deserved better than that from the beginning." After Grace left, Aliska stood in the doorway of the cabin for a while, watching the wagon go down the road. The children were visible in the back, the smallest one waving with the total commitment of the very young. Aliska raised her hand and waved back, and something in her chest was looser than it had been in months. Not relieved exactly, not victorious, just slightly less compressed. She went back inside. She had a list of things to do before supper, and the afternoon was already more than halfway gone. Gavin heard about Grace Kerrigan's visit from Tom, who'd heard it from someone who'd seen the wagon at the cabin. He didn't say anything to Aliska about it directly, which was consistent with his general approach to anything that felt like it had emotional content. But that evening, after supper, when they were both in the main room, her with the household accounts, him with whatever report he'd brought home from the office, he set down his papers and said, without preamble, "You went to the Kerrigans last month because it was the right thing to do." She looked up from the accounts. "I want you to know I understood that," he said. "Even when I was—" A pause. "Even when I came home and you weren't here." She held his gaze. "I know you understood it. I didn't say so at the time." "No," she agreed. "But some things don't need to be said out loud." She looked back at the accounts, then added, "Yours usually don't. You say them differently." He was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" "2 cups of coffee in the morning," she said, "moving over on the wagon bench without being asked. The way you told Hector Birch to stay off your property last month, which you think I don't know about." He didn't deny it. She hadn't expected him to. "You're paying attention," he said. "I pay attention to everything," she said. "It's how I've survived most situations." Another silence. The lamp between them was doing its work, and outside the April wind was making its usual efforts, and the cabin was warm in the specific, particular way that it had been since January. Not just temperature, but something else. Something that had accumulated over months of 2 people living carefully and honestly alongside each other. "Aliska," he said. She looked up again. He seemed to think about whether he was going to finish that thought. Then he said, "I'm glad you're still here." She looked at him. She saw what was in his face. Not the full thing, not the name of it, just its outline, uncertain and unfinished and more honest for being so. "So am I," she said. She went back to the accounts. He went back to his reports. The lamp held steady between them, and neither of them said anything else. And the silence was the kind that held something in it rather than the kind that was simply empty. Outside, Frostvale Ridge was settling into its version of spring, muddy and reluctant and cold enough at night to remind you it wasn't finished with you yet. But inside the cabin, the stove was working properly, the accounts were balanced, and 2 people who were both, in their different ways, bad at easy things, were doing something harder and quieter and more significant than either of them had words for yet. The community supper was 3 weeks away. The rumors were still running. Hector Birch had been noticeably less present in Gavin's orbit since the property conversation, and Vera Colt was presumably still talking, and the town of Frostvale was still making up its mind about the large foreign woman in the sheriff's house. None of that had been resolved. Most of it wouldn't be resolved cleanly or quickly or without cost. But the firewood was stacked. The cellar was solid. The shutter that had been hanging by one hinge in January was properly mounted and painted. And on the kitchen counter, every morning, there were 2 cups of coffee. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to work with, and Aliska had always been good at working with enough. The community supper happened on a Friday evening in the second week of May, in the meeting hall that also served as Frostvale's schoolhouse on weekdays and its occasional courthouse when the circuit judge came through. Someone had put paper lanterns along the front wall, which looked festive, until the draft from the door caught them and set them swinging in a way that threw light erratically across the room. The tables were pushed together in long rows, and the food was the kind that came from a dozen households combined. Some of it excellent, some of it questionable, all of it plentiful. Aliska arrived with Gavin and stood just inside the door for a moment, taking inventory the way she did with every new space she entered. She noted who was already there, where Grace Kerrigan was positioned, near the center, which was Grace's natural habitat, and where Vera Colt was standing, which was near the punch bowl, which was also consistent with Vera's nature. She noted the cluster of people who went carefully neutral when they saw her come in, and the smaller cluster who nodded in her direction with something that looked like genuine acknowledgement. "You're doing that thing," Gavin said quietly beside her. "What thing?" "Counting exits." She glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead at the room, his face composed. "I'm not counting exits," she said. "I'm counting people." "Same impulse." She said nothing because he wasn't wrong. Grace Kerrigan reached them in under 2 minutes, which suggested she'd been watching the door. She had the smallest Kerrigan child on her hip, despite the fact that there were 3 other adults nearby who could have taken the girl, which Aliska had come to understand was a choice Grace made deliberately. The child was her most effective social equipment, disarming in situations that might otherwise be sharp. "Aliska, I'm glad you came." Grace said it like she meant it, which was one of the things Aliska had come to appreciate about her. "Come meet the Fenwick sisters. They've been wanting to be introduced properly." What followed was 2 hours that were neither as terrible nor as easy as Aliska had anticipated. The Fenwick sisters were pleasant women who asked genuine questions and listened to the answers. Old Doc Weaver found her after the meal and said gruffly that the job she'd done at the Kerrigan place was sound, and that he'd heard about the chimney business, and that the town was lucky to have someone with a practical head. He said this like he was reporting a finding rather than paying a compliment, which made it more valuable to Aliska than if he'd dressed it up. Vera Colt said nothing directly to Aliska all evening. She watched from a distance with the expression of someone preserving their position until conditions improved. Hector Birch did not attend, which was noted by Tom Reeves with what appeared to be satisfaction. And then there was a man named Wallace Pruitt. Aliska noticed him mid-evening, a man in his 50s she hadn't seen before, well-dressed in the specific way of people who dressed well to communicate something rather than from habit. He was talking to Owen Kerrigan near the far wall, and twice he looked in her direction with an attention that was too focused to be casual. She mentioned this to Gavin on the walk home. "Pruitt," Gavin said, and something in his voice flattened slightly in the way it did when he was managing his response to something. "He's with the Western Continental Railroad. Survey team's been in the valley 3 days. They're assessing the route." "A railroad," Aliska said. "If it comes through here, it changes everything about Frostvale." He paused. "Town doubles in size, minimum. Maybe more. New money, new people, new problems." She thought about this. And Pruitt was looking at me because he asked questions about the town and people tell him things. Gavin's voice was even, but she'd learned to hear what was underneath evenness. "He'll have heard about you by now. He'll have heard Vera Colt's version," she said. "Possibly." He was quiet for a moment. "Or whoever Vera Colt talks to." It wasn't an alarm, the way Gavin said it, but she filed it. The letter from her sister arrived 6 days later. It came with the Thursday mail in an envelope that was slightly crumpled at one corner from the journey, addressed in Marta's handwriting that was rounder and less careful than Aliska's own. She read it at the kitchen table while Gavin was in town, and she read it twice, and then she set it down and looked at the wall for a while. Marta was better. More than better. She'd found work with a dressmaker in a city 2 territories east, the kind of steady work that came with a room above the shop and a real wage. And she'd been putting money aside, and she'd met a man she was cautious about but interested in, and the city was large enough that no one had history on her, and she was asking, carefully, in the diplomatic way Marta had always written around things she wanted directly, whether Aliska had considered coming east. "There is work here for someone with your abilities," Marta wrote, "and I miss you. I have missed you for 3 years. We could have something like a life together, the way we used to talk about." I know Frostvale was meant to be temporary. I know you took it for the wages. But you can leave now if you want to. The situation I was in is resolved. You don't have to stay somewhere you don't belong for my sake." Eliska read that last line 3 more times. You don't have to stay somewhere you don't belong. The thing was, and this was the thing she sat with, alone at the kitchen table, for the better part of an hour. She didn't know if that sentence was true anymore. She had known, in January, exactly what Frostvale Ridge was. A posting. Difficult conditions, reliable wages, low cost of living, money to send home. She'd been clear-eyed about it. She told herself she would stay until Marta was stable and then reassess. Marta was stable. She should be reassessing. Instead, she was sitting at a kitchen table in a cabin she'd cleaned and repaired and organized and made warm, looking at the stove she'd fixed and the window she'd sealed and the chair she'd re-glued when the joint gave out in February. And she was feeling something she recognized reluctantly as belonging. She didn't know what to do with that. Belonging was a word she'd stopped using around herself a long time ago, after enough places had made it clear it was conditional. She'd gotten good at not wanting it, which was easier than wanting it and having it taken away. And here she was, 5 months in, and the word was sitting in the room with her whether she'd invited it or not. She folded the letter and put it in the notebook. She went back to work. She did not tell Gavin about it that evening, or the next day. She told Margaret. They were at the Pendleton place on a Saturday afternoon, ostensibly because Sam had asked Eliska to look at his school composition and Margaret had asked her to stay for coffee, and really because the thing between them had grown into the kind of friendship that needed very little justification. Eliska took the letter out and set it on the table. Margaret read it without comment. She handed it back. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know," Eliska said. Margaret was quiet in the honest way she had, which was different from Gavin's quiet. His withheld, hers simply waiting. "Do you want to go?" she asked. Eliska thought about Marta's city, about starting over somewhere without history, about the specific relief of anonymity, of being unknown, of not being the large foreign woman in the sheriff's house about whom there were rumors. She thought about a life where no one had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. "Part of me does," she said, "the part that's tired. And the rest of you?" She looked at her coffee cup. "The rest of me is here," she said, which was not a complete answer but was the most honest one she had. Margaret nodded slowly in the way of someone confirming something they'd already understood. "You should tell him," she said. "It's not his decision." "No," Margaret agreed, "but it affects him. And I think you know that." She paused. "I also think you want to know how it affects him. You're just afraid of what you might find out." Eliska looked at her. Margaret looked back, unapologetic. "You're very direct," Eliska said. "I've been widowed for a year," Margaret said. "I don't have time to be indirect about things that matter." Eliska said nothing, but she took the letter back and put it in her coat pocket, and when she walked home that evening, she could feel the weight of it there. Not heavy, but present. The way something unresolved always made itself known. She didn't tell Gavin that night, or the night after. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, which was a thing she recognized even as she was doing it as an excuse. The truth was that she didn't know how to start the conversation, and she didn't know what she wanted the outcome to be. And those two facts together made the conversation feel like standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. Meanwhile, Wallace Pruitt became more visible in Frostvale. The railroad survey team had set up in 2 rooms at the boarding house and were conducting their business from there, meeting with Owen Kerrigan about land values, meeting with Gavin about legal questions related to right-of-way, walking the valley with instruments that the children of Frostvale followed at a respectful distance. Pruitt himself appeared in the general store, at the saloon, at the meeting hall for a public information session that drew most of the town. He was skilled at this, at managing a room, at making complicated things sound inevitable, at suggesting that the question was not whether the railroad came through, but only how smoothly the town chose to accommodate it. Gavin came home from the public meeting with his jaw set in the way that meant he was processing something unpleasant. "He wants right-of-way through the Hallett land," he said, sitting down at the table, "and through the eastern pasture." Eliska set his supper in front of him. "The one you've been disputing, the one that's legally unclear." He looked at his plate without seeing it. If the survey puts the optimal route through there, Pruitt's going to push for a resolution, and Western Continental has lawyers and money, and they're used to winning land questions. Where does that leave the dispute? It leaves it needing to be settled before the railroad makes it settle for them. He picked up his fork. I've been avoiding dealing with it properly for 2 years. I kept thinking it would sort itself or the Hallets would let it go. Now it's going to be decided whether I'm ready or not. She sat down across from him. What do you need? He looked up. What? To settle it properly. What do you need? He looked at her for a moment with the expression that she'd come to understand as him being surprised by her and deciding not to show it. A good land attorney, he said, and the original survey records from when the property was first filed, which I think are in the Territorial Records Office, which is a 3-day ride. Can Tom go? Tom doesn't know what to look for. Then you go, she said. I'll manage here. He looked at her steadily. I'd be gone 4 or 5 days. I know. The weather's still uncertain. I know. He was quiet for a moment. You'd be here alone. She met his eyes. Gavin, I was alone for years before I came here. I think I can manage 4 days. Something moved through his face. Not quite argument, more like the particular discomfort of a man whose protective instinct and practical intelligence are pulling in opposite directions. I'd want you to have a way to get word to Tom if something came up, he said finally. I'll work something out with Margaret. He nodded slowly. He went back to his supper, but she noticed he ate the rest of the meal with the slightly distracted quality of a man whose mind is 2 places at once, and she thought she understood what the other place was. He left on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, she'd gotten the root cellar reshelved, repaired the gap in the stable wall she'd been meaning to get to for weeks, and started a correspondence on Gavin's behalf with a land attorney in the territorial capital whose name Grace Kerrigan had provided, which she'd reasoned was the kind of thing he'd want done and hadn't had time to start himself. She was in the middle of writing the second draft of this letter on Wednesday afternoon when she heard a wagon pull up. She went to the window. It was Wallace Pruitt, alone, without the survey team. He tied his horse at the post and walked to the door with the deliberate pace of someone who'd planned this visit. She opened the door before he knocked. He looked mildly surprised at this. He recovered quickly. Miss Dvorak, I was hoping to find the sheriff in. He's away until the end of the week, she said. I can pass along a message. Pruitt looked at her with the careful, assessing look that she'd noticed at the community supper. Not hostile, not warm, simply evaluating. Perhaps I'll come back, he said. Then, as if it had just occurred to him, I understand you've been managing the household here since January. That's correct. Through the winter. Yes. He tilted his head slightly. Impressive, given the conditions this year. She held the door frame and said nothing. I only ask, Pruitt said, because one of the things Western Continental considers when planning a route through a new community is the stability of the community itself, whether it's the kind of place that attracts and retains capable people. A pause. Some of what I've heard about Frostvale has been mixed on that question. Aliska looked at him. She understood precisely what he was doing. He was telling her that the railroad's assessment of Frostvale depended partly on what picture of the town emerged from these informal conversations, and he was positioning himself as someone who would carry that picture either toward or away from favorability, depending on what he found. He was also, she understood, specifically including her, the question of whether Frostvale was the kind of place that could absorb someone like her in that assessment. It was a sophisticated move. She gave him partial credit for it. Frostvale is exactly the kind of community you're describing, she said. It has capable people, it has resources, and it has the particular tenacity that comes from surviving difficult conditions without giving up or giving in. You might find more polish elsewhere. You won't find more substance. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not agreement, not disagreement. Reevaluation. You argue its case well, he said. It's my home, she said. And only when she heard herself say it did she realize it had stopped being complicated. That in the time between Marta's letter and this moment, standing in a doorway arguing for a place she'd arrived in as a stranger, the word had settled. Pruitt nodded once. He said he'd call again when the sheriff returned, thanked her for her time, and walked back to his wagon. She stood in the doorway and watched him go and thought about what she'd said and found it was still true when she turned it over. Her home. She went back inside. She took the letter from Marta out of the notebook. She sat down at the kitchen table and read it one more time, not looking for a different answer this time, but making sure she understood what she was choosing. Marta was stable. Marta was building something. Marta had a room and a wage and a man she was cautious about, and a city where no one had history on her. Marta was going to be all right without Eliska being in the same territory. She got out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing back. She told Marta she was glad. She told her about the dressmaker's shop and the man in the city, and she said she hoped to hear more about all three. She said she wasn't coming east. She didn't explain extensively. She just said, "I found somewhere." I know that sounds simple, but it's the first time I've been able to say it and believe it. I'm staying. She sealed the letter and put it with the outgoing mail. She went back to the attorney correspondence. Outside, the May evening was settling over Frostvale in shades of blue and purple that she'd come to think of as particular to this valley, more vivid than places she'd lived before, or maybe she'd just been paying more attention. Gavin came back Friday evening, road-worn and carrying a saddlebag full of surveying records that he set on the kitchen table with the expression of someone who'd accomplished something difficult and wasn't ready to talk about it yet. She put supper on. She let him eat and decompress. She told him about Pruitt's visit, matter-of-factly, and watched his expression change when she got to the part about what she'd said. "You told him Frostvale was your home," he said. "Yes." A silence. "Is it?" She looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, he looked tired and something else, something careful, like a man standing near a subject he doesn't want to step on and isn't sure how to get around. "I wrote to my sister this week," she said. "She's doing well. She asked me to come east." He went still. Not outwardly. His hands didn't move, his expression didn't dramatically change, but something in him stopped in the way that things stop when something matters and you're trying very hard not to show how much. "Are you?" he asked. His voice was even, too even. "No," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. And the thing that was in the room, the thing that had been in the room for months, accumulating at the edges of every practical conversation and every cup of coffee and every silence that held more than silence, was there now in the open, not named, not touched, but visible. "Eliska," he said. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Not yet," she said. "I just decided to stay. Let me have that for a day before we—" She stopped herself. "Before we what?" She didn't have the end of that sentence. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was unguarded in a way she'd seen only a handful of times. The way it had been when he'd said, "I didn't like it about coming home to an empty house." The way it was when he talked about Clara, briefly, in that February storm. "All right," he said. They finished supper. She cleared the table. He looked through the surveying records and said the eastern pasture boundary was more clearly in his favor than he'd expected, and she said the attorney letter was drafted and ready for him to review. He said he'd look at it in the morning. They went through the ordinary motions of the end of an evening, and none of it was ordinary, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. When she stopped in the hall outside her door and turned back, he was still at the table, not looking at the records anymore, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who is very, very far inside his own head. "Gavin," she said. He looked up. "I told Pruitt this was my home," she said. "I meant it. I want you to know I meant it." He looked at her. The lamp was behind him and she couldn't see his expression clearly, but she could hear something in the silence he left before he spoke, something taut and honest. "I know," he said. "I'm glad." She went to bed. She lay awake for a while, listening to the night sounds of the cabin and the valley, the creak of wood settling and the distant sound of the wind in the pines, and thought about the word home and how strange it was to have arrived somewhere by accident and found, in the accumulation of ordinary days, something she'd stopped expecting to find. She didn't know what came next. She had some ideas, and they were frightening and necessary, and she trusted that the man at the kitchen table was somewhere in the same country as those ideas, moving toward them with the same careful, grudging honesty with which he did everything else that mattered to him. For tonight, she was staying. That was enough to sleep on. He asked her on a Sunday morning, Not with ceremony, not with anything that could be called preparation, as far as Aliska could tell. He hadn't planned it, or if he had, the plan had collapsed somewhere between whatever he'd intended and what actually came out of his mouth. She was at the stove. He was at the table with his coffee and the attorney's response, which had arrived Thursday, and which he'd been reading and rereading in the way he processed things that required careful handling. The morning was ordinary. The light through the east window was doing what May light did in Frostvale, coming in at an angle that hit the floor in a long, pale rectangle, and she was making eggs, and then he said it. "I don't want you to stay as my housekeeper." She turned around. He was looking at her with the expression she'd only seen a few times, fully unguarded, the careful managed quality entirely gone, just his face and whatever was behind it. He looked, she thought, like a man who had talked himself out of saying this 100 times and had simply run out of arguments against it. "I want you to stay," he said, "as my partner. I mean that in every way there is to mean it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something persistent in the elm at the corner of the cabin, and the morning wind was light enough to barely register, and nothing in the world seemed to be moving except her heart, which was doing something irregular and emphatic. "Gavin," she said, "I know it's not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this. I know that. Claire used to say I had all the romantic instincts of a fence post, and she wasn't wrong, but I mean what I said. I have meant it for a while. I didn't say it because I didn't know if you—" Another stop. "Because I didn't want to make this into something that would make you leave." She looked at him. She looked at this difficult, reticent man who'd left 2 cups of coffee on the counter every morning for 5 months and fixed fences and learned to leave her room for silence and had driven toward her in the dark on a night when he didn't know where she was and couldn't fully explain why the not knowing mattered so much. "You were afraid telling me would make me leave," she said. "Yes. And you're telling me now because you already decided to stay." He held her gaze. "And I thought if there was ever going to be a right time, I was running out of excuses to wait for it." She turned back to the stove because the eggs were about to burn, and she needed 3 seconds to put her face somewhere he couldn't see it. She moved the pan. She thought about Marta's letter, about what she'd said to Pruitt without planning to, about the word home and how she'd arrived at it. She turned back around. "I'm not easy to be with," she said. "I need you to understand that before you say anything else. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'm generally right about them, and I'm not going to stop being right about them because we've changed the arrangement. I send money to my sister, and I intend to keep doing that. I'm going to be the person who climbs onto the roof when the chimney needs fixing because your knee is bad, and I'm not going to pretend I don't notice your knee is bad, and you're going to have to let me say so." He looked at her steadily. "I know who you are. I know you know. I'm telling you because you should hear it said plainly." She looked at him across the kitchen. "And I'm not Clara. I don't want to be a replacement for something you lost. If that's what this is, it's not," he said. His voice was flat with certainty. "She's gone. I loved her. And she's gone, and those are 2 separate true things that I've made my peace with. What I feel about you has nothing to do with what I lost. It has to do with who you are." She held that. She held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you're not sure you were supposed to be given. "All right," she said. He waited. "All right," she said again. And this time it meant something different, and he understood that it did. He let out a breath that was the closest thing to visible relief she'd ever seen from him. Then he picked up his coffee cup with the composure of a man who was not going to make a production of this, and she turned back to the eggs and finished making breakfast, and they ate together at the table in a silence that was different from every silence before it, lighter and also more significant, and she suspected they were both feeling the slight dizziness of something having changed that you can't unchange. After a while, he said, "The attorney thinks the land case is straightforward. Eastern pasture is clearly mine in the original filing." "Good," she said. "He'll handle the documentation. Should be settled before Pruitt needs to finalize the route." "That's good too." He nodded. A pause. "I was thinking we could go to the territorial capital in July. File the necessary paperwork." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on his plate, but there was something in the set of his mouth that was not quite a smile and was not trying very hard to hide itself. "The necessary paperwork," she repeated. "For the land case." he said. "Is that all the paperwork we'd be filing?" Now he looked up, and there it was. Not a smile exactly, but the thing underneath a smile. The thing that was rarer and more real. "We could see what else needs filing while we're there," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her plate. "I suppose we could," she said. They finished breakfast. They washed the dishes. It was an ordinary Sunday morning in Frostvale Ridge, except that it was entirely different from every Sunday morning that had come before it. The news did not stay quiet for long. In a town of 230 people, nothing stayed quiet for long. But the particular nature of this news, that Sheriff Ashcroft and the foreign woman, the large one, the one with the accent, the one who Vera Colt had assured anyone who'd listen would be gone before winter ended, moved through Frostvale with the specific velocity of something people had been waiting to have a confirmed opinion about. Some received it warmly. Tom Reeves shook Gavin's hand with the uncontained satisfaction of a man whose prediction had been validated and who intended to enjoy that for some time. Grace Kerrigan appeared at the cabin 2 days later with a jar of preserves and a hug for Aliska that was brief but genuine. Margaret Pendleton said nothing at all, just looked at Aliska over their coffee with an expression that was equal parts warmth and "I told you so," which Aliska accepted without argument. Others received it differently. Vera Colt's response was immediate and predictable. She revised her narrative. The new version held that she had never truly believed Aliska was after Gavin's property. That was just something people were saying, and what she herself had always felt was that it was a shame he was making such a hasty decision about a woman nobody really knew. Hector Birch said nothing publicly, but was seen at the saloon on a Tuesday evening saying something to Ed Marsh that Ed Marsh later pretended he hadn't heard. There were others, fewer than before, but still present, who communicated their reservations through the specific Frostvale dialect of silence and careful distance. Aliska noticed all of this with the same inventory-taking attention she brought to everything, and she managed it the same way she'd been managing it since January, by continuing to be exactly who she was in every situation that presented itself. The situation that presented itself at the end of May was Vera Colt, directly, at the dry goods store, on a Thursday afternoon. Aliska had gone in for thread and flour. Vera was already there when she arrived, which Aliska noted and did not allow to change her pace. She found her items. She brought them to the counter where Dale Calloway was working, Ida being apparently somewhere in the back. She was engaged in the ordinary transaction of paying when Vera, from the other side of the narrow store, said to no one in particular in the carrying voice she had when she wanted to be heard, "I suppose some men are just grateful for any woman who'll have them, no matter what she looks like." The store went quiet. Dale Calloway looked at his hands on the counter. Aliska picked up her change. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Vera Colt directly, and Vera held her gaze with the expression of someone who had said the thing and was now waiting for the response to make them feel righteous. "Vera," Aliska said. Her voice was completely level. "I've been listening to you for 6 months. I understand that you have strong feelings about my appearance and my background and my right to be in this town. I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly." She paused. "I'm not going to apologize for either. Not to you, not to anyone in this room, not to anyone in Frostvale. My body is not a problem to be resolved. My background is not a flaw to be overlooked. And the fact that Gavin wants to build a life with me says everything about who he is and very little about what I look like." The store was so quiet she could hear the clock on the wall above the door. "Now," Aliska said, "if you have something to say to me directly, say it to me directly. That's the last time I'll extend the invitation." She picked up her parcel. "Good afternoon." She walked out. She stood on the boardwalk outside for a moment, letting the May air do what it did, which was be cold enough to be useful and warm enough to tolerate. Her hands were entirely steady. This surprised her slightly. She'd expected to be shaking or angry or something. What she was, she realized, was tired of carrying other people's assessments of her on her back, and light in the specific way that comes from setting something down you've been carrying for too long. She walked home. Ida Calloway, it turned out, had not been in the back. She'd been at the far end of the store and she'd heard everything, and she told Dale about it when she came out 30 seconds after Aliska left. And Dale told Tom Reeves when he came in for tobacco that afternoon. And Tom thought about it for a day, and then, with great deliberate satisfaction, repeated the essential shape of it to 6 different people over the following week. By the time Gavin heard the version that reached him, filtered through Pete Huxley, who had gotten it from someone who'd gotten it from Dale, it had acquired some embellishments, but the core of it was accurate, and Gavin listened to it with his face very still and his jaw set, and when Pete finished, he said, "That sounds right," and changed the subject. He said nothing to Aliska about it until that evening, when she was in the main room with her mending, and he was across from her doing nothing more important than reading, and he looked up from his page and said, "I heard about the store." She didn't stop mending. "What did you hear?" "Most of it, I think." She looked up. He was watching her with the expression that she had never found a word for and had stopped trying to. The expression that was careful and direct and contained a number of things he wasn't going to say. "Are you going to tell me you could have handled it for me?" she said. "No," he said. "I'm going to tell you that you handled it better than I would have." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in his presence, which was a kind of warmth she'd stopped pretending she didn't feel. "Vera's not done," she said. "No, she isn't. But she's quieter than she was." He paused. "Grace told me Vera's own sister-in-law told her privately to drop it. That's significant." "Grace has a long reach," Aliska said. "Grace decided you were worth the trouble," Gavin said. "She's loyal to the things she decides." Aliska went back to her mending. "I want to say something," she said, "about Vera and the rest of them." "All right. I don't need you to fight them for me. I know you want to. I know you have the impulse, and I know it comes from caring." She chose the word carefully, not looking at him. "But the ones who change their minds do it because of what they see me do, not because of what you say about me. If you defend me against every slight, I become someone who needs defending, and then I'm always going to be that, to them." She heard him let out a slow breath. "I know," he said. "It doesn't make it easier to watch." "No," she agreed. "It wouldn't." She looked up at him. "Thank you for knowing it anyway." He nodded. He went back to his reading. She went back to her mending, and outside, Frostvale Ridge was doing what it always did at the end of May, trying to be spring with one hand and winter with the other, stubborn and particular, exactly itself. June came in warm, legitimately warm for once, the kind of warmth that made the valley look like a different place. The green of the hills deep and vivid, the mud finally dry enough to be merely inconvenient rather than hazardous. The quality of light in the mornings more gold than gray. Aliska woke up on the first morning of June and looked out the window and thought, not for the first time, but with a new specificity, this is where I live. The attorney finalized the Eastern Pasture documentation in the second week of June, and the land question was resolved in Gavin's favor, and Wallace Pruitt, when he came to receive Gavin's confirmation of the right-of-way agreement, shook Gavin's hand and turned to Aliska and said, with what appeared to be genuine regard, "Frostvale is lucky to have people who argue for it the way you do, Miss Dvorak." He paused. "Or whatever your name will be by July." Aliska looked at him. "It'll still be Dvorak," she said. "I'm keeping it." Pruitt raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "A name is a history," she said. "Mine belongs to me." Pruitt looked at her for a moment and then looked at Gavin, and Gavin said, "She's right," with such complete lack of hesitation that Pruitt seemed to decide this was a matter already settled and not worth revisiting. After he left, Gavin looked at her. "You're keeping it." "I told you in January I'm not leaving," she said. "The name came with me. It's staying, too." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that had underneath it something she recognized now as the specific kind of happiness that doesn't need to announce itself. "Aliska Dvorak," he said, the same way he'd said her name for the first time on that platform in the January wind, careful, taking up the right amount of space. "All right." The community supper in late June was different from the one in May. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a transformation scene, where everything is suddenly resolved and everyone who had been cruel has now reformed. Vera Colt was still in the room, still operating. There were still people who managed their curiosity about Aliska through distance rather than approach. The realities of a small town with long memories did not evaporate because of changed circumstances, but the room was different in ways that mattered. Grace Kerrigan placed her at the center table without asking whether she wanted to be there, and placed it as a fact rather than an invitation. Doc Weaver brought his wife specifically to introduce her to Aliska, which the wife managed with the polite determination of someone executing a directive she'd been given at home. Two women who'd been in the whisper cluster outside the millinery in January came and introduced themselves without being introduced, which was a form of small courage that Aliska recognized and chose to receive simply. Sam Pendleton attached himself to her elbow for the first 40 minutes, and she let him, and he was eventually pulled away by the twin Galt boys who were now, apparently, his allies rather than his tormentors. Something had shifted there over the preceding weeks, something she hadn't orchestrated and couldn't entirely account for. She found herself, partway through the evening, standing with Margaret near the side wall, watching the room. "Look at that," Margaret said quietly. Aliska looked. Owen Kerrigan was deep in conversation with a man she didn't recognize. One of the new railroad advance people, she thought, by the cut of his clothes. The meeting hall had both old Frostvale and the first suggestion of new Frostvale in it, the railroad having begun to draw in people who would change the shape of the town before the year was out. "It's going to be different," Aliska said. "Yes," Margaret said. "Frostvale's never going to be what it was 6 months ago." "Is that good or bad?" Margaret considered this with her characteristic honesty. "Both," she said. "Growth always is." Aliska thought about the letter from Marta, which had arrived 3 days ago, full of news, full of the dressmaker's shop, and the man whose name Aliska now knew was Edmund, full of the city, and the winter she'd survived and the spring she was building. Marta had added at the end, in her round, careful hand, "I'm glad you found somewhere. I always knew you would. You just needed a place stubborn enough to deserve you." Aliska had laughed at that, alone at the kitchen table, for long enough that Gavin had come in from outside to see what was wrong. "Nothing," she'd said. "Something Marta wrote." He'd stood for a moment and looked at her, laughing at her sister's letter, and the expression on his face was the one she'd decided to stop trying to catalog because there were no adequate words for it. "She's funny," Aliska had said. "Tell her I said so," he'd said, and went back outside. That was June in Frostvale Ridge. That was the texture of it. Ordinary moments and long days, and the slow, incremental work of building something with another person, which was harder and less romantic, and more real than anything she'd known how to want before she'd arrived here with a cracked satchel and the intention of staying only as long as necessary. Standing in the meeting hall with Margaret, watching the town that was hers now, complicated and imperfect, and full of people she hadn't chosen and couldn't entirely predict, Aliska thought about the platform in January. The cold, the 40-minute late train, the man who'd met her with his coat collar up and his face arranged into something that didn't quite manage to hide the misgiving underneath. She thought about 5 weeks and 6 weeks, the two women before her. She thought about 84 days in a notebook that now had 160-something. She thought about root cellars and chimney pipes and the shutter that had been replaced properly with new hinges and painted to match the trim. About the eastern pasture and the land case and 2 cups of coffee on the counter every morning without fail. About standing in a doorway arguing for a place she'd arrived in as a stranger and realizing mid-sentence that she meant it. She thought she'd stay for as long as necessary, and then she thought she'd stay forever. And now they were the same thing. The evening went late. On the walk home, real warmth in the air now, the first evening of the year that felt genuinely summer-adjacent, Gavin walked beside her on the road that she'd learned every rut and bend of, and didn't say much, and she didn't say much, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. After a while, he said, "You did well tonight." "I was just there," she said. "No," he said. "You were more than there. You never are just there." She looked at the road ahead. The night was clear enough to see the hills against the sky, dark shapes against dark sky with a quality of depth that she'd come to love about this valley. "You're getting better at saying things," she said. "I'm trying," he said. "It doesn't come easy." "I know." A pause. "It means more when it doesn't." He was quiet. Then, "July's 2 weeks away?" "I know. I thought we'd leave the 15th. "That works," she said. They walked the rest of the way in the warm June dark, and when the cabin came into view with the lamp she'd left burning in the kitchen window, Aliska felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for most of her life. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the simple physical fact of a weight finding its resting place at last. She was home. She was going to be home. The rest of it, the complications, the people who still held their distance, the work of building a life out of practical daily choices rather than grand gestures, all of that remained. It would always remain. That was the nature of actual things, as opposed to the things you imagine before you've lived them. But the lamp was on in the kitchen window, and the night was warm, and she was not alone. And that was more than she'd known how to ask for when she'd stepped off a train in January with snow in her hair and a cracked leather bag and the firm intention of not leaving. She hadn't left. She'd done something else instead. They were married on a Saturday in July, in the yard behind the cabin, because Aliska had looked at the meeting hall and said she'd rather be outside where the air was honest. And Gavin had said that was fine with him, and that had been the entirety of the venue discussion. The circuit judge did the legal portion. It took 11 minutes, which included the time the judge spent finding the right page in his record book, and the time Gavin spent repeating a phrase he'd gotten slightly wrong on the first attempt. Aliska did not get anything wrong. She said what she meant in the clear, direct way she said everything. And when it was done, she looked at Gavin and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And then Tom Reeves, who had apparently decided that someone needed to mark the occasion audibly, started clapping, and the small crowd that had gathered, Margaret and Sam, Grace and Owen Kerrigan with their 4 children, Doc Weaver and his wife Pete Huxley, and approximately 30 other residents of Frostvale who had shown up because word had gotten out, joined in. It was not a polished ceremony. The folding chairs Grace had organized were slightly uneven on the grass. Sam Pendleton knocked over a pitcher of lemonade in the first 10 minutes of the reception and spent the rest of the afternoon with a damp patch on his trousers that he tried and failed to hide. Doc Weaver gave a toast that was primarily a medical observation about the health benefits of stable domestic arrangements before his wife redirected him. The cake that Ida Calloway had contributed was good in the middle and slightly dry at the edges, and everyone ate it anyway. Marta arrived the morning of the ceremony. She came off the early train looking tired from the journey and completely undeterred by that tiredness, which was so exactly how Aliska would have described her sister, that she laughed when she saw her on the platform, and then stopped laughing because Marta had her arms around her and was saying something rapid in their shared language that was mostly, "I missed you," said in 4 different ways. Gavin had waited a tactful distance away. When Marta finally let go and turned to look at him with the assessing expression that was clearly a family trait, he met her eyes and said simply, "I'll take good care of her." Marta looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Aliska. "He says 5 words and means 40, Marta said in English, with her rounder accent and her quick directness. "I like him." "I know," Aliska said. "I did too. Eventually." Gavin said nothing, but there was something in his face that Marta apparently found satisfying, because she nodded once and picked up her bag and said, "Someone show me where I'm sleeping." And that was how she entered the cabin that had been, 8 months ago, a place of drafts and 2 low firewood, and an echo that came from one person living in it like he was only partially present. Marta moved through it like weather. She was smaller than Aliska and louder, with the specific social ease of someone who'd had to make herself known in new places often enough that she'd gotten efficient at it. She charmed Tom Reeves in the first 20 minutes. She and Grace Kerrigan had a 45-minute conversation at the reception that Aliska caught pieces of, and that appeared to involve everything from railroad economics to the proper way to store root vegetables. She played with the Kerrigan children with genuine enthusiasm and told Sam Pendleton, who was hovering in her vicinity, that he had excellent posture for his age, which Sam received as seriously as if he'd been told he'd won a prize. She did not meet Vera Colt at the reception, because Vera Colt did not attend. This absence was noted by several people and mentioned to Aliska by no one directly, which was itself a kind of statement. The Frostvale that had gathered in that yard was not the complete Frostvale. It was the portion of it that had decided in their various ways and at their various speeds that Aliska Dvorak was worth showing up for. Aliska looked at the people in the yard and thought about January, about the platform and the looks on the way to the general store, and Hector Birch's knock at the door, and the long months of letting her actions answer questions she'd never agreed to be asked. She thought, this is not everyone. And then, it's enough. That evening, after most people had gone, and it was just Marta and Margaret, and a few others sitting in the golden yard light with whatever was left of the food, Marta leaned over to Aliska and said quietly, in their language, You really did find somewhere. I told you, Eliska said. I didn't fully believe you. A pause. I believed it was better. I didn't believe it was this. Eliska looked at her yard, messy with folding chairs and the aftermath of a party, and the Kerrigan children drawing something in the dirt in the corner. She looked at Gavin, who was across the yard in conversation with Owen Kerrigan, his posture easier than she'd ever seen it in public, one hand in his pocket, saying something that made Owen laugh. Neither did I, she said. Not completely. Not until I was already in it. Marta was quiet for a moment. Then, Edmund asked me something last month. Eliska turned to look at her sister. Marta met her eyes with the expression of someone who was trying to be composed about something that mattered enormously to them. He hasn't done it formally, but he asked if I thought I would want to stay in the city long term. She paused. He met with him. And, Eliska said. Marta looked down at her hands. I told him I needed to come here first, that I needed to see you and know you were all right, and then I could think about things like long term. And now you've seen me, Eliska said. You're more than all right, Marta said quietly. You're... She seemed to look for the word in English and then, not finding it, said it in their language instead. A word that translated roughly as rooted. Planted. A tree that has found sufficient ground. Eliska reached over and put her hand over her sister's. Neither of them said anything else. They'd spent enough of their lives in difficult circumstances that they both understood how to be in a good moment without needing to narrate it. Marta stayed for 11 days. She helped with the harvest prep. She rearranged the pantry in a way that Eliska found slightly irritating and then was forced to admit was more efficient. She taught Sam Pendleton 3 card tricks of increasing complexity and was entirely unapologetic about this when Margaret raised an eyebrow. She sat with Gavin on the porch 2 evenings and talked to him about things Eliska didn't hear directly, but that resulted in Gavin being quieter than usual afterward in the way he was quiet when he was thinking about something important. When Eliska asked him what they'd talked about, he said, Her, you, where you both came from. A pause. She wanted me to understand what it cost you to get here, not the trip, the whole thing. Eliska was quiet. I think I already knew most of it, he said. But it's different hearing someone else say it. What did you say to her? He looked at her. I said I knew who I'd married. She held his gaze for a moment. Did that satisfy her? Apparently, she stopped cross-examining me after that. On the morning Marta's train left, the two of them stood on the platform in the July heat and held on to each other for longer than either would have predicted. Marta said in their language, Come visit before the year is out if you can. Edmund will want to meet you properly. Eliska said she'd try. Marta stepped back and looked at her sister with red eyes she was refusing to cry from, which was a very Marta thing to do. Write more often, she said. You write more often, Eliska said. I write constantly. My letters are very long. Your letters are 3 paragraphs and a list of complaints about the weather. Marta laughed, which broke the tension, which was what Eliska had intended. She watched the train carry her sister east and stood on the platform until it was out of sight, and then she walked to where Gavin was waiting with the wagon and climbed up, and they drove home through the summer morning without needing to discuss it. August came, and with it the railroad construction. The crews arrived in the last week of July. 30 men in the advance team, more behind them. And the town of Frostvale Ridge began the particular transformation that comes when something external decides to take an interest in you. New money arrived. New people, new problems, exactly as Gavin had predicted. 2 new disputes over property boundaries. A disagreement between the railroad foreman and the owner of the boarding house over rates and terms. A fight at the saloon on a Friday night that resulted in 1 broken chair and 1 broken nose and left Tom Reeves with the paperwork of a full day's work before breakfast Saturday. Gavin was busy in ways he hadn't been since before Clara died, but not just with the railroad complications, but with the general expansion of Frostvale's troubles and possibilities, the infrastructure questions that Owen Kerrigan was navigating for the town's financial interests, the legal questions about right-of-way and commerce, and the dozen things that grew up around a railroad like weeds around a new post. He came home tired in the evenings in a different way than he'd been tired before. Not the dull tiredness of a man performing obligations, but the worn-out from actual use tiredness of someone working at capacity, Eliska noticed. She managed accordingly, not taking things off his plate without asking, not making decisions that were his to make, but absorbing what she could of the administrative weight and keeping the home functioning in a way that meant he didn't have to spend energy on it. He noticed what she was doing. He said one evening in August, "You're managing around me." "Yes," she said. I know you don't need it," she said. "I'm doing it because it's practical, and because I want to, and because you do the same for me." She looked at him. "This is what two people building something together actually looks like. It's not romantic. It's just useful." He was quiet. Then, "I know. Do you mind it?" He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to catalog because she knew it now from the inside. The thing in his face when he was struck by something real that he hadn't been expecting. "No," he said. "I don't mind it at all." She went back to the accounts. He went back to his reports. The lamp between them was steady. The conversation with Vera Colt happened in September, and it happened not because Eliska sought it or because Vera initiated it with any noble intention, but because they were both in Doc Weaver's waiting room at the same time on a Tuesday morning, and there was no one else there, and no graceful way for either of them to pretend the other wasn't present. Vera looked older than she had in January. Not dramatically. She was not a woman undone by time, but there was something in her face that had shifted in the way that faces shift when the position you've been holding requires too much effort to sustain. They sat in silence for several minutes. Then Vera said, without looking at her directly, "I heard your sister visited for the wedding." "She did," Eliska said. Another silence. "My sister lives in another territory," Vera said. "I haven't seen her in 4 years." A pause that seemed to cost her something. "We had a falling out." Eliska looked at her. She was genuinely surprised, and she let herself be surprised rather than managing it away. "I'm sorry," she said. Vera glanced at her, looking for something, irony perhaps, or the satisfaction of having been given an opening. She didn't find either. "You mean that?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Eliska said. Vera looked at her hands. "I've said things I shouldn't have," she said. "Not just to you. I have a habit of it." Her voice had the specific flatness of someone who has had this said to them enough times by enough people they couldn't dismiss that they've started to believe it. "My sister is one of the people I've said things to." Eliska didn't say yes, you have, and she didn't say it's all right, because neither of those was honest. What she said was, "What you said about me hurt. I won't pretend it didn't." Vera met her eyes. "No," she said quietly. "I don't imagine it didn't." Doc Weaver's inner door opened. It was Vera's appointment. She stood and gathered her bag and then paused and looked at Eliska with the expression of someone who has more to say and is trying to decide whether to say it and eventually decides. "You're good for this town," she said. "I wouldn't have said so in January. I would have said the opposite, loudly." She paused. "I was wrong." She went through the door. It closed behind her. Eliska sat in the empty waiting room and thought about what had just happened, turning it over carefully. It wasn't redemption. Not the clean-edged kind where someone who'd been wrong became right all at once. It was more complicated than that. Vera Colt was still Vera Colt, still a woman with a sharp tongue and the habit of using it, still holding some version of the position she'd held in January, only eroded now rather than intact. People didn't transform. They shifted, fractionally, under enough sustained pressure from reality. That was the truth of it, and it was less satisfying and more accurate than the story where people saw the light and changed completely. But she'd said I was wrong, and she'd said it without being asked to. Eliska thought that was worth sitting with for a moment. She sat with it. Then Doc Weaver called her name, and she went in. October brought the first cold, the real kind, the kind that meant business. The railroad crew had laid 11 miles of track east of Frostvale and were working through the logistics of the winter pause, and the town had already absorbed enough new money and new people that certain things about it were permanently different. A new boarding house under construction, a second dry goods concern setting up on the western end of the main street, a school teacher brought in specifically because the enrollment numbers had outgrown what the existing arrangement could handle. Eliska was involved in the school teacher question, which had started when Grace Kerrigan asked her opinion on the candidates and somehow ended with Eliska on the selection committee, which had not been her intention, but which she found, on reflection, she didn't mind. She had opinions about what children needed in instruction, and she was not shy about those opinions. And apparently Grace had decided this was an asset rather than an inconvenience. Sam Pendleton, who was in the new teacher's class, came by the cabin on a Thursday after school and told Eliska the new teacher was excellent and strict and had already confiscated 2 of his card tricks. "From Marta," he said mournfully. "I'll tell her," Eliska said. "She'll think it's funny." "It isn't funny," Sam said. "No," Eliska agreed, entirely seriously. "It's devastating." Sam looked at her. "You're making fun of me." "A little," she said. "Come inside, there's bread." He came inside. There was bread. Gavin came home from the office an hour later to find Sam at the kitchen table working through a composition while Eliska mended nearby, and he stood in the doorway for a moment taking in the scene with the expression he'd had at that first moment all those months ago. But different now, all the misgiving replaced by something else. "Evening, Sam," he said. "Evening, Sheriff," Sam said without looking up from his composition. Gavin looked at Eliska. She looked back at him. He put his coat on the hook and went to wash his hands, and that was a Tuesday evening in October in their home. The first snow of the second winter came on a Wednesday in late November. Not the brutal January kind. Just the opening gesture, the snow that says I'm coming, start thinking about it. It fell through the afternoon and by evening had laid a thin white coat over the hills and the yard and the road and the roof of the cabin, and the temperature dropped with it to the kind of cold that was clarifying rather than punishing. Eliska was at the kitchen window when it started. She watched it come down through the glass, the particular quality of the light changing as the clouds thickened, and she thought about a year ago, about arriving on a platform with snow in her hair, about a man who'd been waiting 40 minutes longer than he wanted to, and who'd said wagons out front, and meant, underneath that, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway. Gavin came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything about the snow. He just stood there with his coffee, watching it come down. The same view from the same window that they'd both looked at through all the different seasons of the year. "Same time next year," he said eventually. "You'll have seen 2 full winters here." "I'm aware," she said. "Still not leaving?" She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the snow, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that was the closest thing to mischief she'd ever seen on him. "Still not leaving?" she said. He nodded. "Good." They stood at the window while the snow settled over the valley, over the cabin and the stable and the root cellar with its remortared wall, over the road she'd walked through heat and mud and frost, over the town that had decided before it met her what she was and had been slowly, imperfectly, incompletely revising that decision for 12 months. Over Frostvale Ridge, which was bigger now and louder and less isolated, and still, underneath its expansion, the same particular stubborn place it had always been. There is a kind of belonging that comes easy. You fit somewhere from the start. You're recognized immediately. The place opens for you and you step in. Eliska had never had that kind. What she'd had was the harder kind. The belonging you build through days, through showing up when it's inconvenient, through letting people see you clearly instead of managing what they see, through being wrong sometimes and saying so, through standing still when everything in you wants to move. The belonging that doesn't feel like arrival because it feels like construction. Slow, imperfect, load-bearing. She'd built it here. Not because Frostvale was perfect, and not because the people in it were, and not because she was. Because she'd stayed. Because she'd decided that the alternative, another train, another town, the endless motion of never quite landing, was a thing she was done with. Because a cracked leather satchel and a newspaper advertisement, and a man who said 5 words and meant 40 had added up over 12 months to something she couldn't have described in January and didn't need to describe now. She was here. She was known here. Some people in this town would still look at her sideways. Some would never fully revise their initial assessment, and that was the truth of small places and small people, and she'd made peace with it. But there were children who ran to her in the street. There was a committee she sat on. There was a sister whose letters were getting longer. There was a man beside her at a kitchen window who had learned, slowly and imperfectly and with significant effort, to say the things he meant out loud. That was the sum of it, not a victory, exactly, not the clean-line resolution of a story where everything wraps. Just a life, complicated and particular and genuinely hers, in a place that had cost her something real to earn and that she had no intention of leaving. Outside, the snow kept falling. The second winter of her life in Frostvale Ridge, doing what winters did, covering everything, making the world simpler and more difficult all at once, demanding more of the people who chose to stay in it. She had stayed. She would keep staying. That, in the end, was the whole story.